and social soon thereafter. All of our seminars this season will be available through our YouTube stream, but we hope to see some of you out at Tyson in person when we can do that. A couple of logistical reminders, or maybe you're hearing this for the first time, since you're joining us for the first time. We ask that you type any questions that you'll have for our speaker today in the chat in YouTube, and I will, at the end of the seminar, retrieve those and use those typed questions to ask our fabulous speaker. All the fabulous questions that will be coming in throughout his talk. And so today I am delighted to introduce Dave Jenkins, who is currently a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Central Florida, which is located in Orlando, which I'm sure is miserably hot right now. But fortunately for Dave and for other folks who study aquatic systems and things like community assembly and dispersal across sites, those wetlands that are dotted across the landscape are a fabulous place to be. So you can ask lots of really interesting questions right in your backyard. So Dave got his bachelor's degree at Purdue, his MS and PhD at Virginia Tech. And as I mentioned, he does spend some time in wetlands. I understand that in the 10 years since I was his graduate student at UCF, he's done a lot of things that maybe I wouldn't have expected him to do, and that's what he's going to talk about today. But what I have known of Dave and his expertise is that he studies distributions and dispersal. And dispersal is an element or a mechanism, an activity that connects a lot of his thinking, and particularly the role of dispersal in community assembly and biodiversity at really any scale, even interplanetary scales. And zooplankton has historically been a key study system, although he's been branching out in recent years. So I look forward to seeing what he's going to talk about today. As I mentioned, he was my graduate advisor, and without embarrassing him too much and myself by default, while grad school is fundamentally a stressful experience, my experience with Dave was entirely enjoyable. Mostly because of his mentoring approach, which allowed me to explore any topic I wanted, which unfortunately today has led us in very different directions, but has been critical to my scientific thinking. He allowed me to take risks, for better or worse, and honored my life as a person outside of academia. And he's a super fun and nice guy, and pretty interesting to listen to. So at this point, then, I'm going to hand it over to Dave.
Well, hi, everybody out there in virtual screenland. I'm blushing from Kim's intro there. Thank you. And I guess we could say Kim inspired me to launch off into new directions. So we'll blame Kim for this talk. How's that? No, actually, I'm really honored you guys have asked to hear what I'm going to talk about. And essentially, what I want to do is try to retrace the steps I've been playing with in different ideas over about the last 10 years or so. And so what I'm going to try to do is treat this like it's a linear path, like we're walking down the spiraling yellow brick road right there, but it gets straight eventually. And there's just a few character changes as we go. I'm going with old school here. This is yellow brick road instead of like Harry Potter or something. There's just too many characters there. So this is simple. We're keeping moving forward here, following Dorothy along. And hopefully you can see how I progressed from playing around with zooplankton up towards more global issues. All this work I've been doing here and I'll be describing here has been beyond the work that students do with me in my lab. And what I'm really trying to do is maybe weave the thread between papers, partly because I'm imagining you might sit down to a journal paper and you say, how did these people come up with this stuff? And that's sort of the thread I'm trying to unravel here, where you don't necessarily get a chance to see that when you just read any one paper, right? Okay, so let me go back in ancient time. Pre-internet, in the ancient days when you had to climb a tree and take a picture on something called film before there were drones. And this is where I started doing my PhD work. No, these are not 3D printing for Mayan ruins templates. These were ponds that we filled up with water. You can see in the picture on the right from an aerial view, taken from a plane, not a drone. And so I did a lot of zooplankton stuff as they colonized through the years in that place a long time ago. And so since then, and about the time that Kim showed up, I started playing around with bigger bugs, macroinvertebrates, not the cows that you see in those ponds. They were an influence on the bugs, but not necessarily what we were studying. We try to avoid them, actually. And you can see there's, we have a tradition in our lab. We hang a cork on the ceiling when somebody graduates. So it's been 10 years since Kim was in our lab. And she said, yeah, up with zooplankton, because that's a running joke in our lab. Nobody wants to play with zooplankton anymore. What we have been doing is playing around with mosquitoes and other kinds of aquatic macroinvertebrates, bigger stuff even. Here's a picture of my current student at the bottom there, Jacob. We're setting up sampling. We're tracking mosquitoes around a county, following around behind a spring program, et cetera. So I'm still playing around with the wetlands and things like that. So looking down, staying wet, all that kind of thing. And then while Kim was there, in fact, we had a class. We just argued about chapters in this book, and we thought it'd be a useful seminar series type thing to talk about. And throughout that course, I felt like I was just kind of nagging about, I don't like this, I don't like this. And so my basic complaint was that I don't think they're doing this right. I don't like it. I don't like it. And nobody quite knew why I was having this argument. Okay. So let me see if I can start off at that, because this really is what led me down this path I've been playing with for some time now. All right. So what was wrong? What didn't I like? I'm going to set aside the biodiversity conundrum because it's a whole tangled mess of its own. Typically, when people talk about biodiversity ecosystem function, it's been focusing on species richness. You might know that that's fairly simple. Traditional, I think we should still do it, but there's lots of other ways to measure diversity as well. What I'm going to zero in on here is ecosystem function, or functioning, sometimes it's called, where typically they're measuring biomass production, measured as a rate, grams per meter squared per year or something like that. And then comparing that to biomass was the ultimate thing that I set up, because people are measuring production as biomass. So why is that wrong? Okay, let me see if I can walk you through this. So this idea for biodiversity and ecosystem functioning is to try to evaluate the production diversity relationship, arrow number 1 that you see there, okay? So the whole idea is to see if there's a clear relationship there, the justification being that there's a reason for more diversity if there's more production, right? Okay, but what if when you're measuring production, you can hopefully get this kind of graph, right? But what if you don't? What if it's much more confused? If you get the first graph, then a certain amount, I should say at arrow number 2, you get a certain amount of biomass, and you can say, bam, that predicts really nicely the amount of production that we're trying to evaluate, right? So that's what the hope would be, to get that really nice, clear-cut relationship. Oh, and ideally, it would be a 1-to-1 slope. So I get a certain amount of biomass, and I know how much production there is, because I'm substituting biomass for production, right? But what if it's messy? If it's a mess, then I don't know what the slope is, and I don't have much confidence that that amount of production is indicated by that much biomass. And in fact, what I'm really getting is some sort of relationship that's indicating biomass diversity relationships, right? And that's not the goal. That's not what people are setting out to do. In addition, I hadn't seen that nice tight relationship. I was seeing this mess. And let me show you. This goes back to those experimental ponds. So zooplankton aren't completely done yet. So here's graphs from that old paper. And across all of these, you see couplets of graphs. So rotifers, copepods, Cladocera, and Chiabris. All right, so what we have here is a graph of either productivity on the left-hand side or biomass on the right. Now notice biomass is measured in mass per unit volume, just a snapshot, how much is there. And productivity is mass per liter per day, how much it's being produced, okay? So all of these are through the same amount of time. Yes, these are old graphics because this is, remember, in the primordial Mayan days. So this graph is showing every line is one of those 12 ponds, and this graph is showing the same sort of thing. Now you can see that there's not much of a match between the left and the right for rotifers, and I would argue not much for copepods or Cladocera or Chiabris, this insect that's in the zooplankton. So how much do we know about production biomass coming from zooplankton? Doesn't seem like much. This is why I was complaining. Okay, but I wasn't the only one, because the more I dug into this, I found that as early as 1979, Copeland had amassed a bunch of different studies, grassland studies, where they did live shoot biomass, snapshot, cut it, dry it, wet, and then separately measured how much was grown through the course of a year. That's a more complicated process. Notice that what you would hope for is this one-to-one kind of number. And in fact, what they're getting is quite a schmear from 1 all the way up to 4-to-1. So where you get net primary production as a ratio of biomass, right? There's a whole bunch of different numbers that people are getting for a long time, which means that maybe I wasn't the only one seeing this, but we were forgetting that because we're assuming biomass tells us production. So I said, well, okay, I can't just write a paper that complains about this. I have to try to find an answer. So I think I have an idea, says the scarecrow. What about using log scales? This seems so simple, so straightforward now in hindsight, but it has not been done until this point, right? You'd think people might have already been exploring this, but we have this knowledge now that log scales give us these really nice, tight, pretty patterns for a variety of different organisms. And notice that those are all very similar slopes. Now, this is based on fractal scaling of vascular systems and even within single cell organisms. And this all comes from this idea of macroecology, where we can use these log scaling kinds of graphs to try to find really clear cut patterns and then use those, okay? So basically what I was doing is saying, let me apply what we've been learning about macroecology to these other issues, okay? The production biomass problems. So fortunately, there's a whole lot of those kinds of data available. So what I need is independent biomass and independent production numbers to compare them to each other, right? Well, there's this big program from the late 60s, early 70s, where all these different books and manuals were gathered on how to collect these data. I actually own a couple of these and use them in the ponds. And so I knew we had a bunch of those data out there, and I gathered a bunch of those resources. I actually went to our library and I came back with 2 big stacks of books, carrying them between my hands and my chin, and I amassed 2,220 production biomass data sets in 19 different places. I should say data points in 19 different data sets. I got plants and animal populations, so single species. I got plant and animal assemblages, so community of zooplankton or something. I got ecosystems where they just amass the whole numbers, and biomes, okay? So what do we get? Here's some examples. This is for different populations. Now I'm going to orient you to the graphs again. Here's once again biomass on all the x-axes and productivity or production on the y. Notice that those axes are going to change in the units. They have to because we have different data sets, but the same layout every time. The dashed line in all of these is that ideal one-to-one slope. So ideally, the points would be bam right around that dashed line. Well, you can see in some cases that's not bad. But a lot of cases you'd say, I don't think I like it, right? It's not really fitting very nice to that one-to-one slope. And even if you say the slope is pretty good, pretty much matching that one-to-one, it's offset a little bit on a y-axis or intercept, right? Well, the black line that you see in here is called a standardized major axis regression. And the gray one in here is the ordinary least squares regressions. You're used to seeing ordinary least squares, I suspect. The SMAs are used more appropriately here because biomass is an estimate, not a known quantity like it's assumed to be in an OLS. So we should be using the SMAs in these cases because all these things are estimates. And I would say we have a lot of data for insects, and the slope's not bad for that one-to-one kind of relationship on a log scale. That hadn't been done before, remarkably. Okay, so there's some examples. Let's go back to the plants where a lot of people have been playing around with these things, grassland plants. Okay, it gets more complicated. Did you measure production using live and dead, or live and dead in the amount of litter that had fallen onto the ground? Did you measure biomass as peak live or live and standing dead? There's a bunch of different ways to do this. So here's 4 different ways. And you can see basically it's the same conundrum, same problem. Kind of like the dashed line, but not always. Sometimes it's better fit. In fact, most times it's better fit by one of those SMA regressions. So, okay, what have we got? I think what this means is if you use the log scales, you get a slope that might not be the one, but you can estimate what the slope is. You can use then this log kind of axis to fit better in that line number 1. So in other words, macroecology helps us get to this conundrum of, can we assume that there's a production diversity relationship? Whereas before, there's a lot of mixed evidence and people are debating on and on about this. I think this problem contributed to that debate. Okay. So that was fun. That was okay. That was a paper. But then I started saying, but wait a minute, these are all like individual case study kinds of sets of empirical data sets, right? They're just, these kinds of plants or frogs or something. Is there a general relationship we should assume? Is there some sort of theoretical basis for this? And so the more I scratched my head about it, I realized there's actually a couple different ways to do this and maybe some combinations. So let me go back to metabolic theory and I'll walk through the other ones because you can see their combinations. So the metabolic theory was just this again. Remember the log-log scales again, where we expect, and according to theory, a certain slope that would come from this based on fractal scaling of vascular systems, et cetera, okay? So that's simply put the metabolic scaling. We should get a straight line in a log-log plot and it'd have a theoretical slope to it, okay? But competition has also already been argued to modify that graph. It's not the same slope. Let me show you an example. So Kirchhoff and Enquist, who had been working with metabolic theory quite a bit, said, well, we should get that, what I drew on there was a red line. We should be getting that, but we get less than that. They actually solve for be a 0.46. Theory says it should be a 0.75 or 0.67, depending on who you read. So it's depressed as you go off to the right-hand side. So what's on the right-hand side? Big trees, big biomass, as opposed to way over on the left-hand side where it might be smaller. So what they're arguing is that there's this asymmetric size-based competition where the bigger trees are shading out the small stuff underneath, and they're having a bigger effect than the smaller things would on their competitors, and therefore actually reducing the amount of NPP growth, plant growth, that might be occurring in the subcanopy and on the ground layers, et cetera, in a forest. Okay, so competition, we know, should have some sort of a depressing effect on that slope, et cetera, and that's part of then the theory that applies. But competition is only just one part of what Grime called CSR theory. CSR theory later became a more broad name. I'm going to start using some acronyms here. UAST is Universal Adaptive Strategies Theory. And so Grime and then Pierce put this together in 2012. They generalized beyond plants to say that this sort of strategy applies to lots of different organisms. And the idea is you have different forces that skew organisms' life history strategies to be either strong competitors or not, to be avoiding disturbance or sustaining through disturbance or not, and to be able to sustain through stress or not. So root rules, if you don't know, are like weeds, produce lots of seeds and then die back fast. One way to think about them. Okay, and all of this in Grime's original thinking was related to productivity ultimately. So I said, okay, maybe this is a larger component. And so then talking with Pierce, from Grime and Pierce, we said, you know what, here's three possible graphs. The metabolic theory of ecology says we should get that straight line in a log-log axis, right? So we got biomass and net primary production again. And then competition, just the blue line, would maybe depress that. You might expect that to be progressively leveling out. So we drew that as a curved line. But now if you include the stress and ruderal life history strategies, they should be actually really little growth with any amount of biomass. So you think about a cactus or something like that. It doesn't grow much any given year. They would be more flat line. And then all those intermediates, let me back up a second, all those intermediate characters between just one corner or another, the CS and Rs and that kind of stuff, would be some sort of connection between them, right? So we said, hypothetically, we could agree that the CSR theory, though not anticipating this graph, would be consistent with this. Okay, so I put all those data together just for plants now, not thinking about frogs, et cetera. And what do we get? That's what we get. Why is my screen flashing at me? Okay, so we get this output for all of those different data I had amassed together just for plants, woody species, non-woody species, woody assemblages, communities, in other words, non-woody assemblages, ecosystems, biomes, and then take all the data together and fit that black line through it, the general model. What we end up with is the fact that you get these different thresholds, et cetera, because now it's no longer a straight line. There is a point, a threshold, where it starts to drop faster than you'd expect on a straight line, right? The same sort of thing when it starts to level out at a second threshold. These are also known as tipping points. We should make the distinction that these are non-catastrophic tipping points where we're ending up with not something that completely crashes and burns, it just slides down the hill or uphill a bit farther. So that's introducing a whole nother concept to the fact that we might see some sort of curvature in this as opposed to the straight line metabolic theory, okay? So lo and behold, there might be a general model here across lots of different systems, net primary production as a function of biomass, I found that pretty exciting, that there might be some general pattern, and it seemed to fit this general concept of metabolic theory, log scaling, allometric scaling, and that universal adaptive strategies theory, okay? So I thought that was pretty fun. We're getting these kinds of relationships, and overall on the scatter for that, let me back up, was give or take essentially 1 order of magnitude on NPP. So it worked pretty well, okay? The ecological systems, any one you pick, populations, communities, et cetera, would be sliding up and down that curvature if it's general theory, where you say, I'm going along, I'm taking off some of the biomass, and then boom, down comes the net primary production. That says that there's some sort of strong changes that we could expect in ecological systems in their regrowth, which of course is a pretty big deal for maintaining ecological systems and trying to restore some carbon uptake, et cetera, okay? So tipping points is sort of a new conversation added into metabolic theory then, okay? Okay. That was fun, but wait, I started thinking about some other connections here. We actually have half now. We have the prey half of a predator-prey model, which you probably might know of from these Lotka-Volterra kinds of oscillation graphs, which always seemed really hard to figure out how you make one of those from the original data. Anyway, these kinds of graphs are not where I'm going. I just put it up here to see if you can remember what predator-prey theory looks like. And so I'm going to try to use this macroecological approach towards predator-prey theory now. And thinking about, we've got global patterns, general theory. Can we start playing around with a really broad pattern of a global predator-prey model for plants, where I'm still sticking with net primary production of biomass? Okay, why am I sticking with plants? Because going back to, again, really old theory, 1975 now, older than my ponds, there was this original idea that led to a lot of those ideas about oscillations, et cetera, where we get this graph, and there's different axes, labels here that Neumeyer used, where this is growth, the same as NPP that I used, and vegetation mass, so it's the same idea as my biomass axis I had before. So the graph that he expected has the same axes, but notice it's not log scale. And he said it should peak out at some upper level, because at some point when you get to the maximum volume of growth, you start to decay down here, because he's only focusing in this analysis on the green biomass, the fresh green stuff that would be available to sheep, which was his classic case study kind of study here in his data sets. So what we've got here is a curve that peaks and comes back down. Remember, mine just kind of went up, right? It didn't necessarily level off. Okay, so what I'm going to focus on is, yeah, but wait a minute. I'm not looking at just green biomass here. I'm looking at both. There's the amount of wood on the trees as well as all the leaves. It's a combination. So what do we get? What should we expect if we're talking about both green and brown biomass, not just green alone, as this theory started off with, because I might need to fix this. So here's some recent evidence that shows that, again, we're back on log scales. Here's net primary production again, and biomass, or plant age, or biomass adjusted for ages, as they do in these different versions of this graph. The idea here is that you've got this continual increase, a straight line here in these subsets of data in plant stands, where you've got this increasing straight line pattern on a log scale. Okay, if you think about logarithms for a while, and this is tricky, you have to recognize that a straight line graph like that is actually representing the curvature you see in the green part of my graph off to the right, Neumeyer's original. So what these straight line graphs are representing is actually, in a non-log scale, some sort of curve up to a maximum. And we're again basically lopping off the decay of green stuff as you get more and more brown biomass, okay? We're taking total biomass into account here. So I'm saying we can pretend that that gray part or the brown part doesn't exist in his original theory, and we can work with just that upper asymptote kind of thing. And in the log scales, as those data say, it should keep going up a bit. Okay, that's what I had, right? This kind of shape, and we could argue about whether it's the right shape or not, but the point was it didn't come back down again, right? Okay. What about the human? What about the predator part of this? And I'm focusing on humans here, because we got to admit we're a pretty major consumption of a bunch of biomass, as I'll show you in just a second. So what about this part? And how do we get around to measuring human consumption? I can only find like 2 papers that people have actually used predator-prey models where humans are the predator. It's usually with deer hunting, things like that. It's not something we're comfortable talking about often in a theoretical basis. So how do we actually measure consumption? Well, once again, it turned out that people had already been thinking about this long before me. So Peter Vertusik and other people, and then later Helmut Halberl and a bunch of other people had started mapping out another big acronym, HANPP, which I'll be using here out, human appropriation of net primary production. And notice that these guys, Halberl et al., had already mapped out the HANPP in a couple different ways in this graph here, on this map, I should say, as a percent of net primary production in small granular numbers, 5 arc minute resolution around the world. That's a 10K by a 10K. So if you run a 10K, you ran 1 square of that pixel, okay? We have global data now, in other words, on human, what I'm gonna say is essentially comparable to our consumption, right? Human appropriation of net primary production isn't just the carrots that you eat, it's also the amount of green stuff that is taken up by the building that you're sitting in. The growth that used to be where you're sitting inside of an air-conditioned space like me here in Florida is also part of our appropriation. Our land use makes some amount of net primary production that's appropriated, okay? So we have these data, in other words, okay? So what I could do, I've got global ingredients then. I've got this concept on the right-hand side I'm trying to set up where I got plant biomass and some sort of global number here for how much growth there is, right? The growth and biomass being one of the predator-prey things. That's the prey side. I want to know what the global data look like when I take this growth model, put it on my y-axis, and the biomass, and use that over here on the x-axis. Does that make sense? So I've got the prey side, and we've also got the HANPP, which I'm using as consumption. The same idea, I'm going to try to fit it over here on the y-axis, and again, the same plant biomass on the x-axis. To make these useful, I'm using this per ecoregions, which are defined and also mapped out pretty well. And what I haven't talked about are the 3 possible shapes of these predator functional response curves. You might know these are types 1, 2, and 3, depending on how a predator responds. I could argue about which shape we should expect, but that's okay. I'm going to move on because I want to show you that what we got. Using those data, the HANPP data, the plant biomass data, which are also mapped out, and the net primary production data, this is now the prey on the left and the predator on the right, okay? This is global. Where I had before different data sets that I'd found in the literature, now this is taking global maps of these estimated values. I would say that it matches pretty well what I had found before with other smaller data sets, right? I would get that sort of curvature and NPP, and then why is it not tail off into an S shape? Because it's truncated, essentially. We don't have a lot of these data for a lot of the really sparse, small NPPs that you might get at some smaller local scales, like a plant stand or something like that. So whether it actually tails off to an S shape or not is beyond me right now. I don't know that. I have 2 different NPP graphs showing here. Net primary production potential, how much should be there according to climate and soils and all kinds of other estimates, and how much is actually there as mapped out, okay? Notice that those have shifted in general to the left, the curve shifted over. So as we take out biomass, we lose biomass, but the NPP is still sort of there. It's not necessarily slid down for a number of these places. The arrows that you see here are what it was before and the potential and what it was after and was actual. And you can see with my little pie chart up here, a lot of those tend to shift to the left at the upper end of the graph. But once you hit about the same zone where you see those tipping points, again, curvature, you start to see that they slide down some more, and you also see that a little further to the left. So in general, it does slide down. More of those arrows tend to point down. There's a whole bunch of them you can see, and those colors are indicating latitude. So I think we're already seeing some sort of latitudinal gradient, tropics, tropical rainforests, et cetera, being in the green up here, and other places being lighter shades. Okay, same spectrum over here for latitude, in the same color spectrum, I should say, and HANPP, that consumption functional response curve showing up here now, how much we consume, quote unquote, as a function of how much is there, potential biomass, increases generally straight up and levels off. That's sort of like one of those satiation curves that then maxes out. There's a slight curvature to it, but what's I think pretty interesting here is it looks like there's a lot of scatter over here, again, at the tropics. There are places we've been acquiring quite a bit within any one ecoregion. You see a bunch of variation inside of an ecoregion with those error bars, but there's also some places we haven't hit very hard yet in some of the tropics. So this works. But let's admit there's a lot of scatter there, right? It's not a great relationship, but it works. We can now say we're modeling the human predator functional response globally for plants. So I'd say, yes, we could do this. The original question that we could actually go for a predator-prey model to describe humans and vegetation works. It's guided by that universal adaptive strategies theory and predator-prey theory, the combination. It's using log-log plots, this macroecological scaling. But it's complicated, right? This predator-prey relationship has a lot of fuzz to it. It's not a perfect relationship, which sets up the next step down the road. Can we do a better job? Can we predict this better? Well, it's a global quantitative and 5 arc minute, 10 kilometers, I call that fine scale on a global map, a measure of human impact. So which got me thinking about how we would bring a context to all this, right? And I would say a better model, a more predictive model, the one I just showed you, could help explain the global Anthropocenic effects that we're having, right? It could be a basis for predictions of maybe future impacts. This is kind of fun to think about. And what I'm also thinking about is, compared to literature, we're using some of this predator-prey functional response ecology and inserting it into what has otherwise been a purely socioeconomic framework. And let me show you why I say that. This idea for thinking about impacts goes all the way back to another old paper from 1971, where they just hypothesized this heuristic framework that said, you know, impact is, our human impacts on nature is a function of population size and affluence and technology. And then there's lots of arguments about whether you can use that as an equation, et cetera. Notice 1997, finally, 26 years later, somebody said, okay, whoa, let's make this an equation you can actually solve. And notice when they said, here it is, we're going to use these coefficients. And when you take the logs of everything, they're using essentially what we now call macroecological scaling, where you got log-log plots, right? A log of impact is a function of log, log, and log. Population, affluence, and technology. That's the socioeconomic model that's been applied, where we're only thinking about people. There's really no ecology invested in there. There's no natural resources, no amounts of resource to extract, et cetera. Okay, so what I'm saying is, if we're sticking ecology into this, I don't know what we call this, IPATE? There's not a name for it yet, maybe that's it. And so what I'm doing is I'm gonna be more general than what they've done in the past. A lot of times for technology, they would just assume that it was part of the error term. And I'm saying, well, no, wait a minute, we can stick a term in there. And I'm using greenhouse gas emissions. It's yellow just to remind myself to say that. And those are per capita, the same as affluence is using gross domestic product, like is always used with or without its problems, per capita, and human population. And then ecology being that relationship we had before, which is potential biomass and climate variables. So rather than just chucking it into latitude, I'm actually using some temperature and precipitation data you can get now. All this, again, is global and at relatively fine scale, okay? And it's going to be more complicated because I'm using fancier models that include things called random effects. So these are mixed effect models where there's countries, because all these data points are nested inside of those boundaries, and those clearly are important for looking at socioeconomic data, but also looking into something called anthromes, which is pretty cool, where there are a bunch of different categories, depends on how finally you split them, that basically show that color scale you see across there, where there's dense settlements and high intensity land use, think Manhattan, all the way up to wildlands. And those are categories which also can be used then as random effects, just like a country is a category in a model. Okay, so what do I get? I tried it 2 different ways. First, let's think about the presence and absence of HANPP. Can I predict that? And it worked. I got 1.8 million gridded locations, 168 countries, 19 anthromes. My computer ran hot. And so what we've got here is a binomial model. So it's predicting the presence or absence of HANPP, and it worked pretty well. So there's 2 different R squareds there. 0.57 says those fixed effects. So let me back up. I'm saying those things are fixed effects, and the random effects are in addition, these countries and anthromes, which then add on to give us a total 0.91 R squared. Every dot right along is a 1. So I'm impressed. I'm thinking this is pretty cool. What does the model show us? So what we've got is these random effects are the standard deviations of the random effects. You can basically compare the magnitude of these to the magnitudes of the other effects we see in here. So a 3 and a 1.6, those are pretty substantial, right? They're rivaling or exceeding the numbers we're seeing down below that are in yellow highlights. And I should say, just a reminder, these are all scaled, which means that they're fair to compare between each other. Even though I have different units, I can say how much of one effect compares to how much of another effect. Okay, it's a nice trick to be able to say, now we can compare apples to apples. So I just highlighted the ones that jump out at me. The ones that are point something don't stand out. I'd say population, and I'm putting a combined quadratic, so I want to see if there's some sort of curvature in there, and it works for biomass. And climate, which is the principal components axis, which is just all the temperature variables, works really well too. It's negative because, let's say, that means that the more variable and cooler places are going to be the ones that have more HANPP. So the tropics haven't been hammered as much yet. I think this makes some sense. A binomial model, you should focus on the odds ratio, which is a way of saying, if you increase population 1 standard deviation, scaled units here, we increase the odds of HANPP going up 4-fold, right? Same sort of thing, biomass, 16-fold if you look at just that one value. So, okay, that worked pretty well for predicting presence or absence of HANPP. What about the quantities? A second separate model, because we have different reasons for having zeros. You can't just do a zero inflated one. Less of the data because we left out some of the places where there's zeros. 1.4 million graded locations only, same number of countries and anthrones. The model still works okay. It's a 0.2 for the fixed effects and a 0.63 for the fixed and random effects. Not bad for a global model. I'm still thinking a lot of us ecologists would say, I'll take that, that's not bad. Okay, so now it's different units. Different magnitudes and numbers, I should say, but basically the same kind of model. The numbers up here, 0.27, look like they're actually bigger than a lot of the numbers that you see here. So countries and anthrones really help a lot for predicting the quantitative effects. And you can sort of see that if you look at the R squareds. 0.43, you could say, is sort of attributed to the random. That's a big effect, whereas 0.2 for only the fixed effects, which are listed in the bottom half of the table here. The ones that jump out at me, population again, and this combined effect of biomass, climate, not so obviously a big effect. So I think these are useful. I think this is going to be useful if we think about HANPP as impact, which, by the way, doesn't seem to have been done. People haven't been doing that. We're getting decent fits of the models to the data, surprisingly so to me. Mapping a lot of the world at pretty fine grain, right? I used to run 10Ks all the time, not anymore. We're adding ecology into this socioeconomic framework. So we're beginning to be more socio-ecological, a broader view of these kinds of impacts, focusing on what we do to vegetation. We're using this macroecological scaling approach, which remarkably hadn't been necessarily merged in with a lot of these analyses in the past. And I would say there's a bunch of bells and whistles I'm adding in that improves the statistics. So using better versions of model comparisons and stuff, which also doesn't seem to have been used much. Okay, so can we predict if a place is impacted or not? That's that binomial. Yeah, I'd say it worked out pretty well. And primarily it's population and plant biomass and climate that do that, okay? Can we predict how much a place is impacted? Yes, not as nice as the first one, but still pretty well. And I would say population and biomass come out as, again, the major drivers for our impact measured as our use of green stuff. Okay, so here's a bunch of those acronyms. We're finally getting close to the end of the road. This all has so far helped that production to biomass ratio stuff, and thus that biodiversity ecosystem function mess where people are arguing forever. We're getting better attempts to try to find a general net primary production scaling, which I find still exciting. There's some generality here. So MTE is Metabolic Theory of Ecology, and it's being linked now with the Universal Adaptive Strategies Theory, which I think is kind of fun when you can see a relationship between two separate theories. We're getting a predator-prey context for global human effects on plants, measured as HANPP. And I'm sticking ecology into what was a socioeconomic framework, and now it's still in there, but we're going to call it, I think, socio-ecological now because it's broader, and now I make an IPATE thing. Okay, so do we have fine-scale predictions of global human impacts on terrestrial vegetation? Maybe. I think that's pretty fun to think about. It might be useful. At which point you should be saying, so, I mean, what does this help? What does this do? Well, let me keep going. There's an elephant in the room that is population growth. And it's been going on for a while. It's more than doubled in my lifetime. Between now and the end of the century, it's going to go up another 40% or so if we stick to the median expectations. This is at the heart of a lot of the analyses I'm doing. It's a lot of the heart of what other people have been talking about for a long time. if impact is a function of human population or consumption, you'd say, yeah, no kidding, right? Malthus talked about those kinds of things way back in the 1700s. You might know about Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, which came with lots of dire predictions. And a lot of people didn't like it. And in fact, some of his predictions weren't found to come true, partly because of what Charles Mann's nice book about The Wizard and the Prophet explains nicely, is that somebody named Norman Borlaug, who then got a Nobel Prize, came up with all kinds of impressive new breeds of wheat that then he distributed around the world and fed the world. So we've got this conflict then between prophets who say we're going to, the light at the end of the tunnel is a train, it's not looking good, and the wizards who are saying, yeah, but we can invent our way out of this, we can solve this, okay? So this is an old argument. We've been thinking about this for a long time. And so just bringing us back to population and consumption isn't necessarily new wizardry, okay? We know this, in other words. Scientists write about this all the time. Here's an extract from paper, the red box. I've just highlighted the first sentence of the abstract. The human impact on life on Earth has increased sharply since the 70s, driven by the demands of growing population with rising average per capita income. The same things I was already playing with these analyses. Most of the paper then goes on to talk about the impacts. So we know that this is underlying a lot of this, but we mostly focus on, how many species are becoming threatened, as indicated by the red parts of those circles, et cetera. Okay. In fact, only a few people actually tackle this head on. We don't really address population that much. This is kind of a refreshing paper that way in 2017 that said, look, it's people which drive up the ecological footprint and creates a lot of need for a lot more conservation. And then indices indicating a lot of systems under stress, if you will, are showing that we're seeing a decline in ecosystems, et cetera. Not a lot of papers take it that directly these days. And what I see, I think, what I worry about is that I don't know if this translates up then to policymakers. A recent article talking about climate change and the UN coming out with proclamations on how we should be tracking climate change is actually silent on population. I think I know why. We're focusing on climate change and carbon and mechanisms to try to reduce that without talking about populations, because this is a sensitive subject, right? We want to remember then that an awful lot of people of the worlds were dominated by European colonial history, where people were taken advantage of and told whether they could have children or not, okay? This has not been a nice history. And in fact, you don't have to go all the way to Europe to look into this. A book I recommend that you read, but give yourself time to cry between chapters, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, talks about what we did to the Native Americans. A recent article, a series of articles in the New York Times about what happened in Haiti. And yes, the US was complicit in that as well in causing the problems there. Colonialism has a long, dark history of how it's been wrought on lots of peoples around the world. So for us to talk about population control is a problem. And it somewhat has been hijacked by some of those arguments. As indicated from another news article that I didn't even know was a word, talking about ecofascism. The Buffalo suspect in the shooting there not too long ago allegedly calls himself eco-fascist and blames migration for harm to the environment. I'm just going to throw 3 sentences at you from that same article. The Buffalo suspect calls him that, and then calls himself that. And this idea of eco-fascism, or called green racism, was also invoked by the person who killed people in Christchurch, New Zealand. And just a little bit after the New Zealand attack, another one in El Paso who said, if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable. So the population conundrum, the population problem, as long-lived as it has been, has mutated into becoming this really hot button issue. And I suspect, as I have naturally done, we try to stay out of it, right? So I'm not blaming us for allowing these people to think this way, but can we ecologists perhaps do a better job of explaining how these things work, population growth, and how it affects our planet? I think we can. I think we know how. It's been done. We maybe need in our ecology classes, for example, to talk more about the details of population growth. It's a trade-off between births and death rates, right? It's classic population biology for any organism. And so our births have gone up and deaths have gone down because of things like much better sanitation, healthcare access, nutrition, and I would say energy has had a lot to do with it too, which is of course fossil fuels. Ways to bring birth rates down have been long discussed as part of the demographic transition, which we often sort of lump into just some sort of event that just sort of happens in countries, but it's really down to these mechanisms: access to family planning resources and education access and economic equality, and especially for women who bear the brunt of a lot of these decisions in childbearing in many parts of the world, right? Okay, so we know how to do this. I suspect that a lot of us ecologists don't necessarily dive there when we teach about this, and a lot of us in our papers focusing on zooplankton, et cetera, don't necessarily think about that too, okay? So I'm wondering if this helps us talk about a renewed focus on human population and consumption, and actually bringing ecology into this otherwise socioeconomic analysis might be useful. I think there's a linkage between changes in our green use space, HANPP, as a function of demographic transitions. I bring up the Freakonomics book here. You guys might have heard about it. It's fun, they're cool to read, but they're really coming at things from a purely economic viewpoint, as an economist would. I think we can start thinking beyond just that and bring in ecology as well, like macroecology helps us to do. So I'm suggesting that maybe there's some approaches like macroecology that we should expand and look up towards things and bigger issues for global challenges. I think we should start thinking about how climate and plants interact as a fundamental impact and a resource for most of the world's planet, most of the world's peoples. And ecology can bring into this. 50 years ago, IPAT was proposed and nobody had yet inserted ecology into the argument, interestingly. So some of these things have just been lying dormant and could be used again. And we can get some fancy stats methods now that weren't even possible just a little while ago, okay? So let's bring it home with Dorothy. I would say, just like I've tried to show you here, you can wander into new disciplines. You can find the gaps between disciplines because there be dragons, and that's where the fun part is. That's where a lot of the uncharted territories can be. I was playing around, looking down with zooplankton and mosquitoes and things like that, and this has sort of made me think bigger, made me look up, if you will, figuratively. And by the way, you have analytical skills by doing a lot of ecological work that a lot of the world could use. For example, I think I've found was the case with IPAT, et cetera, right? And so one of the problems with being a generalist, with stepping into new disciplines, is you might find this kind of passive aggressive, you ain't from around here, are you? Kind of a sense to peer reviews and things like that. But on the other hand, take heart in the fact that, like David Epstein argues in his book Range, which I felt was kind of self-affirming, generalists do okay. It's not so bad to be a generalist in this very specializing world, okay? So I think you have opportunities if you think about it. I'm talking to the students in the room that I assume are still connected because I can't see anybody. Okay, so what I'm gonna be doing with our next steps is we're gonna get fancy. We're gonna do a bunch of stats I won't bore you with. And we're gonna try to go beyond the year 2000, those data were. We're gonna try to go earlier, we're gonna try to go later. The people who have been coming up with all those data, HANPP, I'm working with them, and we're going to maybe get into even beyond that, then going further back and further forward if our models can work to do some hindcasts and forecasts. So I don't know, that might also be the next step on this unexplored yellow brick road in front of me. So anyway, that's all I got, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys want to talk about. So thanks for listening. Should I stop sharing?
Fantastic. I can hear the wild round of applause. There is a room. We do have a quick shout out to the undergrads who have started their wonderful summer experience at Tyson, who are actually watching this in person. And I'm going to give them a few minutes to pop some questions into the chat because our undergrad fellows always have fabulous questions. Even though you brought us a lot, Dave, a lot to think about. And so as I try and get my head together, thanks to Jonathan Myers, I have a few questions for you, but we'll start with Jonathan. You know Jonathan, who thinks at similar scales. He says, thank you for a great talk. Ecologists are debating whether local biodiversity loss impacts ecosystem functioning at larger scales. Do your results help advance, clarify, or resolve this debate?
Only perhaps in the front part of that, where I was talking about let's do a better job of estimating production. The other problem with local scale biodiversity and bigger scale questions of how it affects functioning is also then that mismatch between spatial scales, temporal scales. If I keep going into some of the later chunks of what I'm getting at, I don't know how to take that global piece I've been playing with and drill back down into local scale questions. One of the things I'm wondering about as we go forward will be if some of those predictors, population, affluence, technology, ecological things, might not be available globally, right? We might be able to get the HANPP estimates that my colleagues in Austria, Heberl, and others are coming up with, but I don't know if we're going to find matching predictors. And so we might zoom into local scales at some point, because we might say, well, we can get them in the US, for instance, but I don't think we're going to get them in other parts of the world, because a lot of the censuses, et cetera, just don't run that often and that well. So it might be that we have to zoom in locally, and then maybe we could tackle that question by zooming in locally. And then
so I'll follow up with a question I had for you. Well, a couple. One is a clarifying question about HANPP and how you measured it. Originally you showed, I mean, we were talking about the 10 meter square pixels, and you have a slide that shows HANPP across the globe, right?
Yeah. And I didn't do that, by the way. I'm just using their data, which they made available, and then I started conversations with them, and they're co-authors with me on stuff. These guys. They're
generalist enough.
The Institute of Social Ecology in Vienna is where these guys work, and they've been doing this for a while. They use a big vegetation model, which has been calibrated and worked on by a lot of different people, and then they supplemented with some soils data, and they calibrated it again, and they found that it worked out quite well. So they can use that then as an estimator. So a good point. I should say that everything I'm doing is models of models, right? There's a model that predicts how much HANPP should be somewhere. There's a model that predicts how much potential biomass would have been without us messing with it, right? And those models are based on climate and soils and elevation and, you know, lots of other parameters based on known growth of plants. So those details are in their work. I could get deeper.
But so your HANPP is derived from, I guess, where are you inserting the human component? So it seems like it's more of at this 10 by 10 meter pixel, this is the HANPP, right?
Right. And so there's an amount you'd expect naturally, right? Let's say it's this much, I don't know. And now how much of it has come down as a result of land use? That's based on these amazing maps that we have now, right? So I zoom into a city block in Manhattan, I'd say, I see one plant on a rooftop or something, as opposed to what would have been there naturally. And the reduction is at HANPP compared to what would have been there pre-Manhattan.
Right. So I'm going to wrap up my questions because I see some good ones coming in the chat here. But what I was getting at is there a value or a way to, a lot of us here in St. Louis are really focusing on understanding urban ecosystems, right? So scaling down to a system, but looking at a very fine scale, right? And looking, how to mitigate climate change, for instance, through green spaces and things that live in urban spaces, but by integrating humans into that equation, right? We haven't gotten to modeling pieces. We haven't gotten to a lot of the work that we want to do, but is there value or way to look at a pixel and say, not just this is the HANPP, but this population has this amount of impact elsewhere?
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes. So how much green stuff do people in Manhattan import?
What's the consumption, I guess?
Yeah. So there's something that they call embodied HANPP, which is, how much have we gathered from other places? And that is based on trade data, et cetera. Again, my colleagues in Austria have been doing that work. And I would say they've also been drilling down to finer scales, but in select locations around the world. They've done this in Austria, for example, in different parts of the world where they're zooming into, states, et cetera.
Okay. So we can talk about that more later.
Okay.
We do have a couple of points and questions in the chat. Excuse me. One is from Mike Moore, who's a postdoc with the Living Earth Collaborative. It says, thanks for the awesome talk. And then some from I think this is from Susan Flowers directly, or maybe from one of our fabulous undergraduates in the room. Is there career risk with going generalist? You mentioned pushback, and I'm curious, when in one's career path is it safe to cross disciplines and broaden from a specific
That's a great
system?
question. It's something I've wondered about throughout my career, and I kept doing it regardless. I think the classic expectation would be become an expert in something first, right? You become the world's expert on rotifers, right? You're the person that they go to when they want to talk about rotifers. That's what a lot of people have done. I think there's some value, though, if you say, I think I've got some experience in learning how to set up an experiment, learning how to form hypotheses, learning how to evaluate data. I'm trying to keep current in how to do fancy number crunching. And by the way, then, you can give me any various different question, and I can still tackle it with those same sort of skill sets. So it depends on the skill set you're talking about. Is it a matter of running out gels and analyzing sequence data using Bayesian models of a computer program you don't know how to use? Or is it a matter of learning how to do science with a capital S? And I think if you approach it that way, then you sort of have developed a fundamental skill set that you can take to lots of different places. You might have to sell yourself that way. And so now you still might say, well, I applied for this job to be the invertebrate zoologist in this biology department. So, yep, I do invertebrates, as I did, by the way. And that's how I got my first job. And then meanwhile, there I am. I'm playing with these data crunching things. So I think you might have to keep it up your sleeve until you feel comfortable with it. But I also think that the first thing to do is start working on those fundamental skills, how to do science.
Excellent. And further from Susan as well, and or an undergraduate in the room, as undergraduate education tends towards specialization, as graduate education already is. Sorry for the dog.
My dog for a minute.
How do you visualize the future of interdisciplinary undergraduate ecological education?
Ideally, it would go closer to some of the stuff I'm tiptoeing to now, where you truly have a bunch of different disciplines weaving together. That would be awesome. I fear the reality is that it's hard for us to talk between disciplines. It's difficult because we use different jargon. We come to things with different expectations. I submit a paper to a journal and they say, we don't know what you're talking about. And I said, well, it's as plain as the black and white on your face because I wrote it. It makes perfect sense to me, right? So there's this really big difference in how we read things, right? And how we see things. And you have to get past that. That means a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion, or also a lot of resubmittals, which is what I've been doing. So it's not going to be easy, right? We get comfortable in our lane.
Exactly. So going back to one question that I missed from Katie Westby, who's a Tyson staff scientist extraordinaire.
Hey, Katie.
What are the conservation implications? And you kind of got to this a little bit, I think, but what are the conservation implications of the biodiversity productivity relationship? Or if maybe determining if that is a general rule.
I think the conservation implications are what have been argued by lots of other people is that there's an extra justification for maintaining biodiversity. We need biodiversity just to maintain a productive planet, ecosystem, forest, whatever you talk about, what scale you want. I think that justification has been well hashed out. I think all that I did was maybe help those analyses become a little better tuned. In that paper, we found that you could be off by 20% in how much productivity you thought was there, which adds up. And it makes it harder to find a good biodiversity ecosystem services kind of relationship. So I don't think I went all the way to how does it help conservation and biodiversity in that work, but I think we help make that work better and that fundamental argument that already exists.
Great. So I have one final question. I think it might be our last. So last call on the questions, everybody. You talked about integrating ecology into socioeconomic work. What about the flip side of that? And what do you see as some of the ways that we might need to integrate more human activity into fundamental ecological research?
Okay. Whole different manuscript, whole different topic. I could do another seminar if you want. My computer's been running hot today trying to do these analyses. Again, global on invasive species. Where do we find the most invasive species? Kim might remember in my biogeography class, we do data projects. And so I got these guys onto this again this time. And what I'm doing is trying to analyze the data we gathered, and I'm including things like a polity score. Polity is a -10 to +10 kind of gradient that says how autocratic or democratic is a government. Also, how durable is that government as of a certain time? How many years has that style of government been in there? Guess what? That matters for where you find more invasive species or more counts of invasive species. I thought that was fabulous. Now, I'm still working on this paper, but I think, yes, ecologists need to be more socioeconomic. That would be using political stuff. I would say GDP and all that kind of stuff. I've been trying to do since what the heck I had the data. It doesn't matter as much for invasive species. It's probably going to make more sense for resource extraction, like taking up green plants. Maybe economics matters less for, well, guess what? We've got now monitors in Florida now, Yeah, it's because of trade, but it's just a blip in the dollars coming in and out of the state, right? Your flight to Disney costs way more than somebody shipping a Nile monitor in here, right? And turning it loose. So economically, it might not be a strong signal, but the amount of invasives seems to be affected somewhat by the kind of government we have, which is, I think, more related to how much we report stuff. A democratic government is more likely to have a system in place to report invasives than an autocratic dictatorship, fundamentally.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Different story, but I think, yes, we can start going there. And what's kind of fun is I talked to a colleague, Pedro, who said, what are you doing? Cool. We don't think this way. And I think it's kind of fun, again, to cross boundaries.
The time is now. Whitney Anthony Sami, who does work across the city, thinking about connections between ecology and socioeconomics. Do you think that your models can be used to predict areas for food production to help with future food security?
Ideally, that'd be great, but I suspect not, because I think the models are just showing where biomass production happens now and where we harvest. And I think where a lot of what at the upper end of those graphs, the dark green zones and some of those dots, were tropical rainforests. They're the warm climates that have hardly any variation in them. They stay warm and they tend to be pretty wet. Those soils, we know, don't work too well for agriculture. And so even though we're clearing them and trying to grow soybeans so we can have more beef, we know that those aren't going to hold up very long. So I think that I'm not sure how well it translates to food production. And I don't know about other scenarios. That's just the one that comes to my mind. Maybe slightly, but a lot of it has already been taken into account. 25% of the land surface outside of Antarctica and Greenland is already dedicated to pasture lands. We're using it where we can already.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And the rest of it's urban.
Not quite.
Well, urban areas are small, but they have a pretty major impact.
Like a deep dent in the crust.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that is all the questions for now. I would love to chat with you further, Dave.
I can stick around.
As you probably know. And thanks to all the wonderful, to everyone who attended today and asked some good questions. And again, shout out to undergrads in the LLC who, here's my kiddo, who I think asked some really great questions. And that tells me that it's time for us to wrap this up.
It's time to eat.
So thanks, Dave.
Bye.
All right. Bye.